Hi, I'm Mimi Nicklin. I'm a best-selling author and an empathy advocate, and my work is to travel the world, creating more understanding and more connection in businesses and in society worldwide.
What day?
I told you, I practiced it many times.
Sure. You want to just tell us something about how you grew up, and we know Mimi Nicklin today. But where did your childhood start?
Yeah.
Just tell us that story.
The life story.
Yeah, just go for it.
So I grew up in the UK. I've been out the UK for nearly 20 years. So it's actually a funny question for me, because when people ask me, where are you from? I find it a really hard question to answer, because I am from the UK. My passport is a British passport, but it's been so long since I lived there, and I feel, my life, my passion is here in Asia and the Middle East, and it has been for nearly 20 years. So really, how I grew up and how I live today is quite a different life, and I think that's quite unusual for people. But yes, I grew up in the UK. I followed in my father's footsteps. He was an ad man running advertising agencies, and from as young as I can remember, I wanted to be like him. I wanted to follow in his footsteps, and that's what I did. As soon as I became a teenager, I planned how to get into the right university and to get the right graduate scheme to move into the creative industries, and in many ways that led me here to the work I do today. I still write and create content just like this every day. So I think my childhood from a business point of view, from a career point of view, was very much following in my father's footsteps. He was a natural born storyteller, and I think probably so am I.
Which part of the UK? You want to just tell us a little bit of that?
So I grew up in the countryside, in Hampshire, which is the south of England, about an hour south of London. And I really grew up, surrounded by cows and farms and a really green life. It wasn't until much later in my life that I moved into the city. Ironically, now I only live in cities. So I've spent the last 20 years of my life moving around Asia from urban hub to urban hub. And I'm definitely a city girl now, but yeah, I started in the countryside.
What was that moment where you kind of okay, this is the path that I want to go on?
Yeah.
When did that happen? Was it early on? Was it after working in the corporate world? Or what was that? When did that happen?
You know what? I don't really believe that there's a moment. People ask me this all the time, what led you to do this? What was that shift? And I don't think there was one specific shift. Having said that, and I'll come back to that, but having said that, I took a role in Dubai in 2018, and I took over a big American global communications business. When I took over that role, if I err on the side of caution, I'll say it wasn't quite what was sold to me before I joined. And the honest truth was I was entirely overwhelmed by that role. I had come from very corporate, structured, large business, and I ended up running this organization in Dubai, which was small and kind of all over the place. I had no network. I knew nobody in Dubai. And I had to turn around this business that wasn't doing very well. And as I said, I was totally overwhelmed. So in that way, there was a turning point in my life, because I went to meet a business coach, my first and only time. And I asked her, can you help me understand what is going on in this city? How do I navigate this time and this sort of season of my life? And she was asking me about my leadership style. And at the time, I was talking about intuition. And she stopped me and she asked me a question that fundamentally changed my life, because she said to me, Mimi, is it intuition or is it empathy? And in that moment, I was like, no. Well, what's empathy got to do with anything? Certainly not the business world. But it did then lead me to leave that lunch and start to research empathy and discover something called the empathy deficit, which is the lack of connectivity in our world. And fundamentally, that then became the moment that changed my life, because after that, I started to write my first book. I wrote the book, I never thought I'd write a book. I wasn't a born author, but I started to write because nobody else was at the time, and I felt like the world should know about this. I started to write, and that book a few months later became a bestseller. I had a podcast at the time, and 85,000 people came, and by the end of that year, which was 2020 actually, life was very different. So in that way, there was a moment that led to a series of moments. But I think I've been doing this now for about 5 years, and it's only very recently, I think, that I have really realized that I'm living in that moment. You know, that my purpose found me. I didn't go and search for it. You know, so many people are searching for their purpose. I didn't search for mine. I feel maybe I'm very lucky, but definitely it found me. So.
Amazing. That's amazing, because a lot of people, like we said, find that moment, and then maybe they're looking for that moment, and that's why they never get there.
They never find it.
Happen, right?
Yeah,
so
maybe.
That's amazing. So I have to bring this up.
Yes.
Because you spoke about empathy.
Yep.
Right, and so you have to tell us. And I saw on Instagram as well. You had something about empathy and sympathy and all those things. Go for it. What is empathy?
What is empathy?
Everyone's favorite question. Right?
Everyone's favorite question. So empathy is fundamentally perspective taking. That's all it is. It's the ability to understand the perspective of another. Why do they think the way they think, or why are they behaving the way they're behaving, or on occasion, why do they feel the way that they feel? So empathy is a skill set. It's built into your brain. We are all born with it. You don't have more than me, and I don't have more than the other person. It's built in the prefrontal cortex, and it's a pro-evolutionary skill set. So what that means is it exists to protect the human race. We need it to survive, not to thrive. And it is a skill set. So sympathy, compassion, these are totally different things. I very often say to my business audiences, you know, I'm not talking about being nice. This is a hard-working skill set, hard to find, hard to master, with really hard business results. For example, 23% higher profit. So many hard business results on the back of this fundamental human skill, which is to understand others.
It's amazing. I'm learning a lot.
Yeah, because I've seen sometimes people say like maybe sympathy is a negative thing, where it's like people take it as pity sometimes. And what are your thoughts on that? Do you think that that's necessarily a bad thing, or?
You want me to answer it here or answer it there?
Yeah.
It's fine?
Yeah.
Okay, fine. So probably one of the biggest questions I get asked is to specify the difference between empathy and sympathy. And the simple answer is they are nothing alike. Empathy is a skill set. Sympathy is an emotion. Empathy will pull you closer together in business or otherwise, and we can talk about business impact. But when you understand someone, you are able to be closer to them. You are able to drive them to perform better, to motivate them. You see higher levels of loyalty, lower levels of attrition, higher levels of effectiveness and efficiency. The data is endless because I, as a leader, understand you. Versus sympathy, which is like pity. They're actually the same thing, sympathy and pity. It's a very well-intentioned emotion, right? It's a kind emotion, but it is an emotion. And in that emotion, sympathy will draw you apart, right? Where empathy will bring you together. When you empathize, you understand. Therefore, I am closer to you, whether that's in leadership or relationships or life. Sympathy, as I said, well-intentioned, but here's some flowers. I am sorry for you. Right? I'm not getting any closer to you. I'm not stepping into your world. I'm not connecting with you, but I'm showing a positive emotion or intention towards you. So they are very different skill sets. Whether there is a place for sympathy or indeed compassion, which, by the way, is then an action. So if empathy is a skill set and sympathy is an emotion, compassion is the action, right? I am behaving compassionately to this community, society, or person. Whether there's a place for compassion and sympathy in the workplace would be for somebody else to answer. But for me, my work is around that data set, humanity's data set. Because in the end, how can you ever lead if you don't first understand? There you go.
Yeah.
So, I think you deal with a lot of leaders. That's a lot of, in terms of what you do. Two things, in terms of like, the second part of the question is, how do you get them to be more empathetic? Is that the right word?
Yeah.
And then before that, what is your process in terms of getting them to understand why empathy is so important for them as a leader in that specific context? Because you can be empathetic as a human in general things, but then in the business world especially, everyone's about profit, money, things, and of course other things, but generally, you know.
Yeah, and they are not, let me say that again for the camera. Profit and empathy are not mutually exclusive. They are deeply connected. So when you ask me, how do you convince more business people, more leaders to leverage their empathy? It's by telling them that. I touched earlier on this 23% figure. We know that organizations that have empathetic cultures are 23% more profitable. They are 17% more effective. They are 68% more engaged in terms of their staff. And of course, that means you are saving on all kinds of money and resources because your people aren't leaving. And worldwide today, we have an attrition crisis, right? So people resigning, you hear about silent quitters or great resignation. Organizations that have the skill set, the ability to understand, so I know how to motivate you, because the reality is it's never just about money, not anymore. Today, coming here to this interview, I met with an Uber driver, a young software engineer who's also driving Uber on the side. And I asked him, tell me about the leaders in your business and how good are they? And he said to me, well, they're good and bad. And he explained to me one of the things he's very happy about is he gets a good salary. But, he said, immediately, but there is no engagement at all. No parties, no celebrations, no team activities. So he said, I get good money, but I'm really bored, right? Which is his way of expressing that lack of connection. He's being paid and he'll turn up for as long as until he finds a job that pays better or the same, right? So how do I convince leaders? By telling them this, and this is just a tiny bit of that data that shows how understanding drives your business. Whether it's product development, whether it's client relationships, in the end, it all comes back to understanding. How can you innovate a product if you don't know what your audience wants? How can you build trust if you don't understand how people want to trust you? How can you drive inclusion, whether that's female or otherwise, if you don't know how the group you're including wants to be included? So I convince them with the data. In terms of where that's coming from, like the growth in leaders wanting to know this, I think we've had a massive shift. Again, when I started 5 years ago, I felt like I was just speaking to like a big black social media hole and like hoping that someone was listening. Today, my inbox is full. I don't have to. I meet people like you all the time who say, hey, should we have a conversation about this? So empathy is rising. The world knows. If you Google empathy and anything you are interested in, empathy in finance, empathy in investment, empathy in leadership, empathy in technology, education, family, you will find endless results. So we are at a tipping point. I think businesses today know that there is far more to performance, to success, and to profit than simply the bottom line. Because in the end, the fourth industrial revolution, which is what we're in right now, is about the people and not just the platforms or the sort of innovation that we're seeing around them. Did I answer your question?
This is a very easy interview.
This is a bit more of a specific question, I think. But when people talk about being empathetic in leadership, sometimes people take it to being like, okay, just being nice.
Yeah.
Whereas I think now, as I'm speaking to you, I'm understanding it's different to that. And would you say that being an empathetic leader does involve sometimes when you understand someone, that does that encapsulate sometimes leading with like tough love sometimes? Because you understand that maybe this is what works, or am I wrong there? Is it just that?
No, listen, I think your question is a very common question, particularly in South Asia, right? The whole of South Asia. I get asked this, there's two questions I get all the time. One is, do women have more empathy than men? The answer is no. But the second is this question, which is, does empathetic leadership mean soft or kind or nice leadership? But the irony is to that question that often the most hard realities are the most empathetic ones. So let me give you an example for that. If you have someone in a team that is not performing, You know they're not performing and they know they're not performing, and so do all of their colleagues. Nobody is comfortable, right? You're not comfortable as a business owner because, you're spending money and not getting any return. They know too, as do their colleagues. The most empathetic action is to move them, either out the company, so to fire them, or, come to some mutual agreement, or to find a different place in the business for them. But leaving them there to sink, for everybody to watch, in pain, is the least empathetic thing you can do. Because empathy is data, and once you have that data, once you understand, you can use that to make tough decisions. So, we see a lot of resignations because leaders aren't empathetic enough. We see a lot of people leaving. And when you look at the data around why they're leaving, it's very rarely because people are mean, right? It's because there's a lack of insight. They don't feel that they belong or that their voice is heard, especially with young people, right? I don't think anybody cares. So why should I stay? Nobody's listening anyway. So no, it's never a soft thing. Even if you're making redundancies, mass redundancies, that can be done with insight. You see empathy written about often by the FBI in hostage negotiations and by organizations such as the army going into war zones. So empathy is a skill that is being used in the most sort of hard-edged, tough, aggressive environments to conflict manage, to negotiate, to get to positive results. So in short, empathy will never be a soft skill and it will never have a soft outcome.
So you've built empathy everywhere.
Yeah.
That's that. Would you want to just tell me something about how that started or how that process went about, what it is today, what the plan is?
Yeah.
Just something about it.
This purpose work became me, which means I never set out to be an entrepreneur. I never set out to have a business, to set up Empathy Everywhere as a business. It was a passion for years, and perhaps that's the best way, right? To be able to be afforded the opportunity to be able to take a passion into something that earns profit. But Empathy Everywhere today is a small team of people that work directly with me to help me reach the world and drive this education, this awareness further. And you're right, I work with lots of leaders particularly across Asia and the Gulf, Saudi, Dubai, looking at training programs. I do a lot of keynote speaking on stages, consulting, some executive coaching, working with leaders or teams to look at what empathy is and fundamentally listening, because listening is the skill set that enables empathy. So most of the time, that's what I'm teaching. I'm working with those organizations around the world to create experiences or education that drive culture back together, that help people connect, drive up motivation, create programs and influences and organizations that, shift culture and performance. So yeah, my passion became my business. We are very proudly headquartered in Colombo in Sri Lanka. And we also have a team in Malaysia, and we're growing everywhere, but our heart will always be here.
And then, mind if I ask, how did this connection with Sri Lanka come? How did you're headquartered here, and I'm sure there's a link.
Yeah.
If you'd like to talk about that.
Look, I think it depends what people believe in. But for me, I felt like I was called to Sri Lanka. When I landed here in 2021, I had never been here. So when I moved here with my daughter, my pets, my furniture, my whole life, I left the Middle East and I moved here. I had never been here. I had this, deep sense that I should move to Sri Lanka. So I did. Whilst my let's say formative years living in Colombo were not easy years because we had COVID and there was economic and political and social unrest for the first few years when I was here. It wasn't a soft landing, let's say that. It will always be part of me and I will never leave. I now live in Malaysia and travel back to Sri Lanka for very kind of infrastructure driven reasons, particularly an international airport given my travel. But Sri Lanka's in my soul. And I have a vision which will become a reality to build up an all-female team here in Colombo that can lead all of our training programs. And we're also moving into technology and AI from Colombo with talent here in Colombo and in my tiny little way to put Sri Lanka on the map in some of those conversations where it isn't yet today.
For you personally, you say that this is your passion, right? But is it your passion because you've understood that this is strategically the best way to go about it? Or is it more from a sense of you think that people, should be a little bit more empathetic? And let's say, for example, if being empathetic didn't increase productivity, but it kept it the same,
yes,
would this still be your passion? Would you still advocate for this?
You know what? No one's ever asked me that. That's a good question. I think it does come from both. I think the reason I'm so passionate about it is because the impact is so big, is so impactful, an impactful impact. Let me rephrase that for the camera, because impactful impact definitely doesn't work. I think it's a really good question, because where that passion comes from is very much in two areas. Yes, there is an impact on the world, and there has never been a time when our world needed more understanding than now. 52% of our planet is lonely, and loneliness is killing us. You are statistically likely to die 8 years earlier if you're lonely. You cannot survive, you cannot heal from illnesses and diseases as well as people who are not lonely. As humans, we need to be connected, to be together. And according to the Surgeon General in the USA, to be chronically lonely is now as dangerous as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So there is a let me help impact the world driver to this passion. We need it. We have to reconnect our world. We actually have no choice, because it is taking away from humanity for as long as we let that deficit continue. But in the business world, when you talk about strategic leadership, yes, I'm passionate because it works. And actually, the more I do the work, and I'm really lucky I get to work with governments and organizations and all kinds of amazing people, the more I see that impact everywhere, hence empathy everywhere, right? Whether it's small business, whether it's government policy, whether it's NGOs, whether it's corporate kind of FMCG businesses, there are no environments that don't grow, that don't do better when empathy is put into the core. Whether that's culturally, which is the ideal, or it may be, for example, into an innovation process to improve the impact of that innovation, the effectiveness of the innovation, the direction of the innovation. Because in the end, this is a skill set that people need to grow, whether that's personally in our relationships or it's in our businesses. So where does my passion come from? I think it comes from wanting to make a difference in the world, to help people. That's what drives me, that act to help. But it's very quickly followed by the fact that I know it will create impact in the business world, and I get that feedback every day. So the data is growing, not just my data, but the global data. So I won't stop anytime soon.
Do you think that part of tackling loneliness is also just building the strength, maybe, or the inner ability to be alone and not suffer from loneliness? Is that a part of it at all? Or
yeah, look, I think it could be. The definition of loneliness is really important here. So to be lonely is not a lack of having people around us. It's not the physical aloneness. It's a lack of connectivity. So one of the chapters in my first book is actually called Lonely But Not Alone. So it talks to your question, right? Which is that we spend all of our time in offices surrounded by people, outside in the community, in the mosque, wherever you are, you're surrounded by people all the time. But that doesn't mean that you're not lonely, because loneliness is being connected to other people, and you can be in a crowd and be completely disconnected. So the solution to loneliness lies within individuals fundamentally. Are there ways that organizations and governments can help from a policy, community, or sort of behavioral point of view? Yes. We can provide services that help bring people back together to connect. But fundamentally, loneliness is an individual reality. And the only person, I say this to everyone, the only person that can solve your loneliness is you. If you stay at home and live in the loneliness, no one else can solve it for you, right? So I believe that nothing phenomenal ever came from a comfort zone, right? Being comfortable will never lead you to greatness, but it will also never lead you to connection. Staying at home and watching Netflix every night may be very comfortable, but it won't solve the loneliness epidemic. And if that's for someone that feels that loneliness, and statistically it's half the room we're in now. So you and I are talking, but there are camera people, there are lighting people, there are people all around us. Statistically, half of them are already lonely. So it's a social reality. It's one that we have created ourselves, society has created. But the solution to it has to sit within individuals and within their families. I don't think it's a resilient answer. I don't think, sort of in your question there, is it that people are just not capable of being alone? No, because the physical aloneness is actually quite different from the emotional reality of loneliness, which is detrimental to your health physiologically as well as mentally or emotionally.
So for me, I was very interested in you deal with a lot of people around the world. And you're from the West, at least. What do you see in terms of differences in leaders or businesses, in terms of how empathetic they are, or in general, in terms of how they run things, between that divide?
So the interesting thing is, the answer can only be very personal because there is no data around it. So people ask me all the time, is there a rank or an audit for the most empathetic places on earth, which there isn't today. But what we do know, and what I see all the time, is that But what we do know, and what I see all the time, is that in more connected, collectivist societies, you're going to see higher levels of natural empathy versus those more, tends to be Western, individualized, individualistic, or sort of setups and societies where you're going to see lower levels of empathy. So most of my work is in the East and the Gulf for a reason, because they actually are, in my experience, far more empathetic societies at large. They have group, communal living and thinking at heart. They have hospitality at heart. They want to live in groups. Whereas in many of the Western markets today, so in many of those cities, actually, from a statistical point of view, you have 48% of households are lone households. 50% of major cities like Berlin and London and Tokyo's on there are just people living all alone. So of course, empathy is a skill set. And if you live all alone the whole time and you wake up alone and go to work alone and come home alone, you have no opportunity to practice that skill set. So my experience for sure is at the eastern side of the world. And I can't really include this, but I would include Africa, even though that's not really the East. But as a continent, you see a lot more natural empathy in those cultures as well, because people are communal living. You see more multi-generational households. You see more communities that are engaging on a regular basis. So whilst there's no data to support it, I would say you can probably divide the world in half, and the more westernized markets will have lower levels of empathy than the East.
What are more sort of conscious things that people can do on a day-to-day or even within their business or within their work to actually grow these skills and get better empathy?
So the backbone to all empathy is listening, is curiosity. So the antidote to low empathy is curiosity, really. We're talking about being engaged and interested in communicating with other people. So even if you live all alone and you have a very perhaps isolated or just singular focused life, those micro moments of engagement are where you can create and practice empathy. So I often talk to my audiences about just those tiny moments in a day when you can empathize, when you can engage with the people you come across, which tends to be, especially in the East, tends to be some level of service staff, whether that's Uber drivers, taxi drivers, the barrister in the coffee shop, a security guard, anybody that is in the role of helping others tend to be the people that we come across every day when we're walking through a mall or we're getting on a metro, someone's taking your ticket, whatever that is. In those moments, in those micro moments, practicing connection in those moments not only helps you practice, but you will see huge difference in your life and in theirs, because empathy is reciprocal. I call it reverse empathy. It means that when I have a moment of empathy with you, you will empathize with me. And because empathy is pro-social, our brains are attuned to make that feel good. So you will see the happy hormone, serotonin, released into the body when we feel understood. So if you go about your life making more connection with others, actually looking people in the eye, asking people what their name is, listening to their replies, not only will you impact them because they will feel seen, but you will feel better. So there will be that reciprocal benefit. So if you are living alone and you are struggling to practice your empathy, start with strangers, because it's not half as intimidating as it feels.
That's good. Can I also ask for you personally, if you've been someone that has practiced this for many years, do you feel like you are at the sort of pinnacle of this skill set? Maybe is there a moment in your life, or maybe a specific situation or a person that you deal with, that you feel like you're struggling maybe to connect with this person, and where you feel like maybe you're still lacking in a certain area of empathy?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I definitely am not perfect, and I think probably none of us are, because as with any skill set, you need to continually practice it. There's a couple of things I would say to that. Number one, and I said this to a team yesterday, if there is someone in your life that does not want to listen, especially if they're in the older years of their life, you have to also eventually admit defeat, right? Some people can't be changed. So yes, I can think of one person, particularly in my life, who I know that they are never going to listen. There is no point me trying. There is no point me pushing that person to engage on a deeper level. That doesn't mean I can't empathize with them, and I try, right? Comes back to patience often. But you just know that there are some people, it could be in your work, it could be in your family, anywhere in your life, that it's not your role to change them. So yes, there are times when it's very difficult, and I think, empathy has two great enemies. One is low time, and the other is high stress. And probably we don't have time for a neuroscience lesson now, but that is due to neuroscience. It's due to the way the brain reacts to stress. In its simplest form, when we're under very high stress, the energy and the blood in your brain is directed away from the part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, where you use your empathy. So me and all of us, if you are under intense stress or strain, or you feel at risk in any way, your empathetic ability will reduce, because at that moment, your body's in survival mode. So yes, there are many, let's say, occasions in life where empathizing is not necessarily the easy choice, but it is always the right choice. It's just about whether we can direct that in the moment.
A lot of our viewers are business leaders, people in the investment community, dealing with money, investments. So, and they're working somewhere, or they're working for someone, or they're running businesses, right? So, what is like the biggest issue you've seen around the world from different businesses that you've tried to help in terms of things that probably goes wrong for them, which is probably also going wrong for a lot of people watching as well? What is something, or one or two things that people are going through, and is there a fix for it, or at least identifying the problem? Is that start the journey at least?
I think probably the biggest issue that I work with my clients on today, if I look at all of the things that people come to me about, or I hear them speak about, multi-generational realities is probably the biggest. And what I mean by multi-generational realities is organizations that have a really wide range of ages, of generations within them. So for the first time in history, we have 4 generations in many of our workplaces, particularly again in South Asia, where we have many family-run businesses. So you'll have somebody at the top, often a man, might be in their 70s, sometimes 80s, occasionally in places like Sri Lanka, even into their 90s, and they're still in the business. And then all the way at the other end, you have like 17-year-olds coming in. So the 17-year-old and the 75-year-old have very little in common, right? They can't even speak the same language. So I would say the biggest challenge for leaders today is embracing all of these different generations, which come with all kinds of differences, not just language, but opinions and expectations and values. And it comes back to some of the things we spoke about earlier, the role of money, the role of salary. For the older generation, they still believe that salary, how much you are paid, is fundamental to getting and keeping a job. But there's new research, for example, out of the University of Oxford in the UK that will show it's only in the top 5 and it's not in the top 3, right? So the younger generations want different things from their workplace. And in that research from Oxford, what it showed is that most employers today believe that the 2 key drivers for employees are money and flexibility. But when they did the research with the employees, and it's with Indeed.com, so it was over 2 million employees. This is probably the largest data out there. They found that money and flexibility wasn't there at all. And actually what they're looking for is trust and recognition. They want to be seen. They want to be heard. They want to use their voices. So I would say the biggest challenge for all leaders, particularly businesses that are growing, is how do you work with and include all of these different generations and different opinions and different expectations within one culture that leads to success.
I'm having a masterclass.
You're like, let's just carry on for a while.
This is amazing. And what was the biggest change that you saw from any company around the world in terms of? I'm really sorry.
No, it's the aircon. I'm also like sniffing and.
Like in terms of they understood everything, and maybe they didn't before that, and they understood it, something clicked, and maybe they did something small or something big or something, and then they actually saw results. And the results coming from anything. And like from your personal experience, what was something that was very heartwarming, or something that was amazing, or whatever it is that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I know exactly the story I want to share with you. So I had a client in India, and it was a technology company, a software business in Mumbai, and predominantly young male workforce of software developers. And the client, the CEO, came to me and said, listen, we have so many resignations, I can't keep up with them. And Mimi, I keep paying them more, but they're still leaving. And the first thing I asked him was, well, Sanjay, have you asked them why they're leaving? And he was like, no. I was like, so maybe let's start there, right? So he went away and I told him, I tell all my clients, feed your people first, give them food. You will find out all your answers over a meal, and speak to them. Speak to the ones that are still there about why their colleagues are leaving, why their friends are leaving. It's all young guys. And then I left them to that. And a little while later, I called him back, maybe 6 weeks, and to say, how's it going and how did the research go and where are you today? And he said, Mimi, it's amazing. People have stopped resigning. And I said, well, what did you do? And he said, well, Mimi, we changed the coffee machine. And I was like, okay, you're going to need to tell me a little bit more about that. So what happened when he spoke to these young men was that they uncovered this insight, this empathy, that these young guys in Mumbai today, apparently, not cool to drink chai. That's not cool. Grandma drinks chai. I don't want to drink chai. I want to drink coffee, ideally in some type of American Starbucks type cup, right? But that's really expensive. So if you ever have added up how much you spend on takeaway coffee, or just do not add up. I do it every day. Terrible decision. But what was happening was, for these young men, you need me to stop because the camera stopped? Okay. So what was happening for these young men was that they wanted to be seen with a cup of coffee, but they didn't actually have the disposable income for it. And in the office, they had a coffee machine, but it was one of those Nescafe machines from like 1995. And that was not cool. They didn't want that coffee in those little cups. So, this insight came out, and in the end, the CEO got them an espresso machine, organized to get fresh milk delivered in the morning rather than the UHT, the long life milk, and got really nice cups made with their logo actually, but that they could carry around. And it was just that tiny act that helped his staff know that he understands us. He gets us. We just want a decent coffee, right? And it saved him a huge amount of money. He didn't have to give, 15 pay rises. He just had to buy an espresso machine. So it's a tiny example, and of course it's part of a bigger picture, but so often those are the stories that come back. That in that empathy, that's why I say you cannot lead if you don't first listen. How can you lead anybody if you don't know what they want? And in this case, all they wanted was good coffee.
It's amazing. Is there a problem with the coffee? That's amazing actually, because you realize how sometimes it's not about how, I think what I'm starting to learn is it's not about how small or big of an action that the leader takes, because it doesn't matter if you don't understand what the problem is in the first place.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah,
I think
exactly.
That's at least my takeaway.
Yeah.
Because there's no point solving a problem you don't understand.
Yeah.
Right? So it's not about the small or big, it's about understanding. That's amazing.
Because the risk is otherwise you solve the wrong problem.
Exactly.
right? So empathy is judgmentless and agreementless. There's no agreement, no judgment. There's simply understanding. When you don't have empathy, what leaders lead on is assumption. Now, often that assumption is accurate because they have 30 years behind them. They know a lot, right? They have a lot of experience. So the assumptions may be accurate, but they may not be. And because of this multi-generational world, more and more the assumptions aren't. Because you're going to assume, like that University of Oxford study shows, I'm going to assume that you want money because we all wanted money. Doesn't everybody want money? And until they actually ask their staff and find out, of course they have to have money, but that's not what's going to keep them here, you know? So that's the risk. When there isn't enough empathy, you are leading on assumption, and then your risk is far greater.
So for people who are not, I mean, everyone today is excited by a video or a podcast visually. There's a lot of people who really learn in our office as well, who really, and I know we have an amazing book, Softening the Edge, because I'm going to read it after this for sure. Right? What would that one chapter be, or one thing that you can tell us about that?
So I've just finished my third book. So I have many books, but I would go back to a sentence I've already said today, which is that to lead, you need to first listen. And I think listening is this skill that is so underthought about, because we think we are listening all the time, but most of the time you are simply hearing, which is a natural occurring ability for most people that have good hearing, versus listening, which is an active skill set. So if I had to tell the audience one thing, I would ask them this question. I would say to them, are you listening to understand, or are you actually listening to reply? And do you know the difference? And if not, you can go and find out.
Yep.
I think that was
Are we done?
amazing. That was amazing.
Amazing.
Just a good wrap.
You forgot something.
Last question, routine.
Oh,
yes.
Good job, someone's got it.
Our favorite question.
What is it?
So, okay, what's your daily routine?
What's my daily routine?
Go for it. Just as a person that's traveling, that's busy, and a lot of leaders today, like, or at least the audience today, they want to know, like, how do people balance, like, work-life balance, this and
Yeah.
that. So once you're done with that, maybe you can just talk about a little bit about how you balance your family. Work is one, but then you be empathetic about people like at home as well. It's so important. So maybe you can just show us that.
Okay. So the reality is I can't share my daily routine because literally no day is the same because I travel so much. But what I can tell you is some of the principles of my daily routines that help me stay consistent and help me deliver on this, regardless of whatever time zone or aeroplane I'm waking up on. So a couple of things that are really important to me. The first thing is that I very carefully choose my language every day. And probably the question I get asked most about this is, how do you have the time to do all of this, Mimi? How do you have the time? Every time I turn on my thing, you're in another country. And what I explain to people is the neuroscience of language. And one of the big shifts I made to my daily routine a few years ago was shifting the words have time to create time. So now every day I ask myself, how will I create time for X, Y, and Z? And it has been like a monumental shift because I feel like now I always have time, right? Because it's a very empowering way to look at your time. When you say to yourself, I didn't have time, that is self-fulfilling. That is your subconscious teaching your conscious mind. You didn't have time. That is a definitive. But when you say, I didn't create time, you are opening yourself up to do it differently tomorrow. So the first principle I live by is by creating time and owning that. The second, at least when I'm at home, is to make sure that I make time for my family from 7 o'clock every night. I can log back on later, but I have a very clear section of my day that is for my daughter, my pets, my partner, just my life. And that's in my diary. You know, I block that off. And the third thing is I believe in saying yes to everything, which is very against the sort of media rhetoric about work-life balance. I think the more you say yes to, the more you create. And so pretty much within reason, I say yes to everybody. And I think that the concept of balance is flawed. personally, and it's quite controversial, I don't believe that balance exists. I believe that integration exists, because in every hour of the day, you have a choice. And that, again, it's extremely empowering. I am choosing to be here with you right now on this show. But in that choice, I am also choosing not to be with my daughter. That's the truth. I chose to be here. I chose to leave her behind. There is no balance in this hour. I can't half be her mum and half be with you. And I think once we make peace with that, it's a relief. Choose your time, choose it wisely, choose it so it works for you, but understand it's a choice. There is no such thing as balance. You can't be in two places or with two people doing different things at the same time. So that has also been really life-altering for me, because I feel in control of the hours that I'm awake every day.
Amazing. Yeah. So it's like take that accountability on
Oh yeah, massive.
I
Yeah.
never heard that, but I really like the last part about balance. I like
Yeah, it doesn't exist. Honestly, it doesn't. And particularly as a woman, there's a huge pressure that media inadvertently puts on us by telling us that we should find balance, because it's impossible, right? Particularly as working parents, we can't be in two places at once, but we continue to read in the media that we should be. So therefore, we are failing over and over again. And the definition of disappointment sits there, right? So I always say to people that the gap between expectation and reality is disappointment. So change your expectations or change your reality, but otherwise you're going to sit in disappointment all the time.
Yep.
It's a wrap.
That's all.
It's a wrap.
Thank you very much.